On the last topic of this evening, which is universal jurisdiction as a means of prosecution of human rights violations in Syria. I'm really, really impressed that still such a big crowd is here, and I think that it's so far it has been absolutely worth being here, and we will find a new perspective now with 4 distinguished speakers. My name is Bente Scheller. I'm the Middle East Office's Director of Heinrich Böll Foundation living in Beirut, and I will be the moderator for a panel with 4 distinguished experts from different angles. If you were not here before, I kindly apologize for not being able to take any questions from the public because we have little time and we have 4 people here on the panel tonight. Therefore, we don't do it as we usually do in these rooms that we have a discussion, but I'm sure that you can pick it up directly one-on-one also, as you have been taking these occasions already in the breaks. So I'm very happy to be seeing, after years actually again, Mr. Mazen Darwish, a Syrian lawyer who's joining us tonight. Mr. Mazen Darwish is not only a lawyer, he's also the president of the Syria Center for Media and Freedom of Expression. And in this capacity, he was arrested in 2012 and only released in 2015. His colleagues were arrested along with him, and some were released a bit earlier. Mazen, you really served a long sentence, if one can even speak of a sentence, being in a Syrian prison. And you were awarded several awards and prizes, among others, the Pinter International Writer of Courage Award and the UNESCO's World Press Freedom Prize. So thank you very much for being here with us tonight to share the Syrian perspective. We have heard a little bit of that, but I think that you have chosen to address why is the issue of international possibilities to prosecute crimes done in Syria so important.
Thank you very much. And thank you for all of you to being coming and to stay up to now. Really, I appreciate. And it seemed like I'm very happy in Germany since I came. I have a safe life, and even I can speak in my native language today. So this is wonderful. So I will shift to Arabic. شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you very much. I believe everybody has received a sufficient dose of what is transpiring inside Syrian prisons. And I don't think it's about information or evidence anymore. It is unacceptable for anyone to speak today about the truth of what's happening in Syria. There is an unprecedented amount of documents, of reports, of evidence, of information from investigative agencies at the international level or professional international organizations which are known for their independence and their professionalism. And there is live coverage of atrocities being committed in Syria, whether we're talking about the use of chemical weapons, of barrel bombs, torture, executions inside prisons and detaining centers, and so on and so forth. As a refugee in Germany or in any other European country, well, today I'm not going to speak about the complaint in the legal sense. Of course, here there are professors from whom I can learn. But I will focus on Mazen as a ordinary Syrian citizen. There's a complaint filed in Germany against war crimes committed in Syria. Today, I'm one of the people who is completely intolerant towards radicalism. This complaint today saved me from turning into a violent extremist and possibly a terrorist. The feeling of injustice, being exposed to torture and abused, the international community denying the values with which I grew up and in which I believed, human dignity, human rights, the feeling of despair. Although I feel safe, I mean, I'm in Germany, I have a safe place to stay, my daily requirements are covered. However, my experience, being tortured for years and years, my loved ones that I lost, my relatives that I lost as a result of the use of chemical weapons, the use of horrific means, all those massacres. Can I just forget all that just because I'm safe now? Just because I have a place to stay? Just because I have food? Impossible. Due to this complaint, I still believe that there is a possibility for justice. There is a possibility for the perpetuation or for upholding these values. And I had started to doubt those values. I had started to think that they were just propaganda. Without justice, without the feeling of hope, that there is someone who's concerned with my suffering, I would be a lonely wolf that is following all these extremist ideologies epitomized by Daesh and Al-Nusra Front. If we're concerned with combating terrorism, we must show true commitment towards accountability and justice in Syria and in other countries. People are not born extremists or terrorists. There are no terrorist genes or extremist genes. Suppression, oppression, injustice, dictatorship, the feeling of the unfeasibility of justice, that is what turns a human being to a terrorist. Now I, Mazen, the refugee, me and my family, we need this complaint. We need this trial so that I start thinking about going back to Syria. I speak in my personal capacity, but I represent dozens of Syrians. This is not the first time I get detained. And of course, my father got detained. I took my wife once to the prison. Her father has been detained. Is it conceivable for me and for dozens and thousands of other Syrian refugees to go back to Syria with no justice or no accountability? With no guarantee that war crimes and the perpetrators of those violations and those who gave those orders, at the very least, they should not be the rulers. They should not be those responsible for state institutions. I would not feel safe to go back until they're held accountable. I, Mazen, the Syrian citizen, feel a deep rift in Syria. Can anyone convince me that warlords, when they sit around a negotiation table at the international level and they talk about their interests and they share the privileges among them, their interests among them, does that mean we would act as if nothing had happened? Does that mean the Syrian society is protected without accountability, without justice? We would be creating the ground or preparing the ground for a civil war in Syria that will continue for decades and decades and would completely destroy the remainder of the Syrian fabric in my country. Without justice, we have retaliation. We have revenge. Justice does not seek revenge. I said previously, months ago, when we filed a complaint in Paris, I said that if I get my right, I would waiver it for my country. I said, I hope to feel bad for my prison guards. I wish for them and for their children to have a bright future, and to have a bright future that they share with my children. But it is impossible to imagine, after all that has happened, it is impossible to imagine that there is a possibility to make peace in Syria without accountability and without an integrated path for transitional justice that guarantees the rights of victims and guarantees the possibility of living again in Syria. This is why, ladies and gentlemen, this complaint is of paramount importance for me. This complaint of course, it discloses all these violations, all these crimes. And as we've seen in various reports, they are true. But today, so much has been fabricated by the media. So much has been manipulated. We have experienced counter-propaganda until 2012. Some even doubt that we are actually victims. We're just terrorists. We're portrayed as terrorists, proponents of Daesh, proponents of the Syrian front, and these people are there. They do exist. Yes, they do exist. However, not all opponents to the regime is a proponent of Daesh or al-Nusra front or terrorists. And I think European media holds part of this responsibility, bears part of this responsibility. For me, for example, every Monday, I consult the internet, and if there's no interview with al-Assad, I get surprised. I'm worried about him. Is he sick or something? Why isn't there an interview with al-Assad? So every day I check the internet to see the interviews with al-Assad, just making sure he's okay. So today, we turned into people who have a national democratic project, a humanitarian project. We aspire to dignity, to justice, to life according to what we've learned from you. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I'm not responsible for that. I'm not the one who actually wrote the Universal Declaration. But if you really meant it, and this is what we thought, and this is what I still believe in, we have to limit impunity in general and in Syria specifically. It is unacceptable today in the 21st century to reward killers, to reward murderers. We grant them immunity. We grant them the possibility to stay in government for another 2 terms of office. After they finish the terms of office, after the other 2 terms of office, I mean, forever and ever. As if our fate as Syrians is to live under oppression. As if we're destined to remain degraded, to remain oppressed by the regime. a regime that blackmails the whole world with terrorism that it creates. No one would be safe. Unfortunately, no one would be safe without justice. No one would be safe. Since yesterday, since we announced the complaint, I received, and I'm not exaggerating, hundreds of calls. I have seen joy that I've never seen before, well, since I was released. I've been contacted by people who've expressed their extreme joy. One of those people is the mother of a colleague. I am Rasoul. He's a 20-year-old doctor who is annoyingly peaceful. Really annoyingly peaceful. I mean, I work with him, and I'm an activist, a human rights activist, and very peaceful, but I'm so annoyed by how peaceful he actually is. When he was arrested, and I see among the audience some of the people who were detained with me, we're very fortunate to still be alive, but Ayham died under torture in branch 215. One of the branches that we target through this complaint. And his mother is dreaming of one thing, her son's body, so that she can visit him, she can put flowers on his grave. I don't think this is too much to ask for. Today she called me. She didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to respond. We are human beings who today are feeling joy because there is hope for justice. We need to build on this hope. This hope needs to continue. We need to send a very clear message to Syrians and to non-Syrians, namely that democracy is still a principle that we have to commit to. Human rights are not propaganda. It's our humanity. This is what distinguishes us from animals. What distinguishes us is justice. If we deny justice, we deny our humanity. And this is the question that everybody should think about. Are we actually human beings, or are we only claiming to be human beings? And the test is in Syria. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mazen, for this very personal account. And it's really so clear, but yet always I find it suffocating to rethink of how many human fates, how many lives of people who are directly and indirectly affected by the violence that is happening in Syria until today are affected. So thank you very much. Coming back to the complaint, you pointed out to us the importance that it has for Syrians that they are not only victims any longer, but through this complaint as well as through other means they take agency and they speak out for their rights. I would like to talk to Patrick now. Patrick Croker is a lawyer who's working with the European Centre for Constitutional and Human Rights, our partner tonight for this event. And there he works in the Programme for International Crimes and Legal Responsibility. Therefore, coming from this very personal perspective, what it actually means to have this possibility of having this claim. Could you maybe elaborate what made you pick on this case? How do you see the chances of it becoming a case, becoming accepted, and what does it mean from your perspective to have it?
Yeah, thank you. I think Ayham's story that Mazen just told is a very, very good example exactly of answering the 2 points of your question. What does this case mean and what do we expect from it? Because Ayham's brother is actually part of the complaint and demanding justice in his own right now for his brother who was forcefully disappeared and tortured to death in one of the prisons that we address in the complaint. That's sort of at the outset when we started thinking about more in detail about how to approach this case, which was more than a year ago, together with Mazen and Anwar and also many other Syrian organizations who we met through the whole time, and many of them are present today, which is really amazing to see. That was really basically very promising from a legal point of view and very shocking at the same time how well these crimes were documented. This has been said previously on the panels, especially speaking about torture. Human Rights Watch as early as 2012 with the report on the torture archipelago came out, and since then the prisons were known and the locations of them and the first accounts came to life. And so we really had this bulk of documentation, not only by the international NGOs, but also and especially by the Syrian NGOs that I already mentioned, that do this kind of documentation, risking their lives in many instances, and many times their work is not honored enough because it's really the basis of all of our work. Also, we had sort of this crime-based evidence for torture, which was very, very clear, but more and more also the sort of command structures became clearer, because we think it's important not only to address single crimes. It was said before, the DNA of the power or the DNA of the regime consists of this systematic torture, and if we want to change something, then we need to address this policy aspect of it. And to address this policy aspect, you need to go after people who are responsible, who are in power, and those are exactly the kind of people that hide behind their desks many times, that don't get their hands dirty doing the torture themselves, and that many times also profit later on from a political process, maybe granting them impunity. And to go after these people, you need a different kind of evidence to link them to these horrible crimes. And more also, even this is revealed very, very cynically by a way of documenting by the Syrian regime itself, in which way people are being treated. I don't know if you know the Caesar photos, but even on these photos there are cards held into the picture, and they tell you the numbers of the branches where the people were detained and killed, and the prison numbers they had, and we have seen reports of transfer orders where they just copy basically the whole security apparatus into the reports, because they also want to secure themselves into all directions, going really up to the highest level of the intelligence apparatus. And so also this was extremely well documented, and so we and at the same time also speaking with especially many Syrian lawyers, activists, organization. There was a huge amount of frustration in the first workshops that basically started a year and a half ago, and I had prepared sort of trying to set a bit the landscape of international law, and they said, we know all that. We have been told the promises of this basically since the very beginning, because ever since we were started to being treated that way, everybody said, wait, we have human rights, we have international criminal law, document these crimes, the day of justice will come one day. And they said, we know all this stuff already, we had our workshops, we want to get active, we want to have concrete results. And so it became very clear we need to push for something very concretely. And then also because you've heard it on the previous panel, they are very real people. They are here, they're among us, and they have experienced it, and they're also demanding their right to justice right now. And so we cooperated with them, and from then on it was very clear which direction it should take. Germany, this has also been mentioned, being a very obvious addressee, the German federal prosecutor, for our complaint. because it is possible to bring cases here, even for people as complainants who don't have double nationality. And we have a federal prosecutor who is engaging in investigations already, but not quite on the level that we would want them to do it, because they're kind of they call it structural investigations, and it's very necessary and good to basically collect all the evidence and to secure it also for future purposes. But the sort of suspect-related investigations that are taking place, and there are 23 as of today. There was one arrest warrant today that you might have heard of in Düsseldorf against an al-Nusra fighter. So it's basically only against people who happen to be here. Of course, they're war criminals, so nobody would deny the necessity of them being punished, right? And it's also understandable that the prosecutor goes for them because he's legally obliged to go for war criminals that are present in the country, of course. But the policy element, to go after the most responsible people in order to address the systematic character of attacks, that's something that hasn't happened. And so basically taking all this up together, we thought, to use Lotte's words, the mills of justice, they run slowly, and in Germany they really slowly started turning. Let's try to make some wind, and let's try to make them run a bit faster. And I think with the response that we had, and all of you coming here, and really also Syrian people, I'm not exaggerating if I say from all over the world who came here today, that really shows we are blowing some wind into their direction, which is very good, which is very, very necessary, but which also means a huge responsibility, not only on part of the federal prosecutor, that's of course, but also for our work, because we today there's hope, Mazen said, but also we need to make something happen now, and it will also be on us to follow up on this. With the help also with many of the people in the room, to really try to push this forward, and it will maybe be a process that will be slower than we want it to be, but we have realistic chances because of all these circumstances that the case will be taken up and also directed against some suspects, and it's our role now to make it happen.
Thank you very much, Patrick. After you leading us to addressing the structures behind the system and have the broader perspective going from the single case to those responsible. James Rodehever, who's with us here from the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Syria. You joined the commission in 2014, and before you also have been dealing with other difficult tasks, as for example the Deputy Director of the United Nations Assistance Mission to Afghanistan. So you come from one conflict to the other in this commission. We know that there have been efforts since 2011 to document and to investigate. We have this new commission that Lotte Leicht earlier was talking about, or not a commission, a mechanism to be established. Please let us know, what are these efforts directed at, and to what extent do you see these efforts as complementary?
Well, thank you very much, Bente, and I'd just like to start by saying what a real honor it is to share a stage with Mazen Darwish, and as well as Ambassador Rapp and Patrick Coker. It's I always tend to get a lot of energy from people who feel passionately about what they do and that do it very well. So it's a real honor. I'm very pleased to speak to you all tonight on behalf of the Commission of Inquiry and on behalf of the commissioners, Paolo Pinheiro, Carla Del Ponte, and Karen Abu Zaid. This is really an apt moment to discuss the work that we've been doing. I think that right now what is so incredibly frustrating is that right at a time when the political talks and the political process is they're attempting to restart it, and maybe it's possible to make some progress. that accountability very necessarily has to come forward, and it has to be pushed forward. The Commission just released a report yesterday where we tried to make that very point in terms of what happened in Aleppo. That Aleppo was ground zero in terms of being an example of just the horrors of this war. And in particular, Syria is ground zero for the great assault, the great threat that is currently being experienced by human rights and international humanitarian law more generally. The Syrian conflict, unfortunately, is one in which no parties to the armed conflict are observing even the most basic laws of war in most respects. It's also a conflict in which the ferocity and the level of violence seems only to increase as impunity becomes more entrenched. And so finding any means to pursue accountability is something that I believe is rather central to pushing forward with peace in Syria. In terms of the Commission of Inquiry, the issue of accountability has been one that we've pushed forward for quite a long time. It's in part because of the mandate that we've had since 2011. Which has been a dual mandate of investigation and documentation of human rights violations, all human rights violations in the conflict, and to, wherever possible, identify alleged perpetrators of those violations for purposes of supporting accountability. And it's through that latter part of the process we're asked to specifically look for individuals that have perpetrated crimes against humanity. And we've also been asked to look in past at massacres and war crimes. So at this point, we have conducted investigations that have led to interviews of over 6,000 victims in the Syrian conflict. And those interviews are rather key to the future and how we proceed with our mandate, both in terms of advocacy and in terms of how we contribute to the accountability effort, other than publicly reporting on the findings that we make. This database of interviews is the core material that could be used by prosecutors in future. As a crime base, of course, but to lay out sort of a roadmap of the conflict. Now, as part of our obligation to identify perpetrators, this information, wherever possible and wherever we are able to meet our legal standard of proof to identify a perpetrator, either an individual or a commander or a command structure, or a group or unit that has been directly involved in the commission of a violation. We have, for years now, been preparing lists, confidential lists of perpetrators. Now, the list of perpetrators, it has to be said, is, in the end, only useful as a list of names, as a place saying, these are the names that you should start with whenever you're doing an investigation. But in terms of developing a strategic approach either to the violations themselves or building a case against individuals, you'll need to have the information in the interviews in our database. Now, we have tried to adhere to the best practices of UN commissions of inquiry when it comes to a decision on whether to share the names that we have accumulated. About 2 years ago, the commissioners took a decision not to release names for a variety of reasons. One being that in past, all other examples of commissions that have released names, of which there have only been 2, they did so because there was already a referral or a guarantee of referral of those names once they were shared, either with the Secretary General or the Security Council. Those are in the cases of the Commission of Inquiry into Darfur and the Commission of Inquiry for Guinea. And in this case, of course, we don't have such a referral. There was a thought that perhaps names could be shared as a way to force another vote on a referral, but it's very clear that that was not going to have that effect. So as I say, 2 years ago, the decision was taken, okay, don't release the names, but what we can start doing is releasing the data, the interviews, to support the application of universal jurisdiction. And so for the last 2 years, we have been working under a policy of targeted disclosure, where essentially we receive specific requests from either prosecutorial or judicial officials, authorities, that have committed to investigate a specific individual or incident. And based on if their request is specific, whether it comes from a jurisdiction that respects fair trial and due process rights, and whether, of course, we have information that is relevant to their request, and this is the final part that's rather key, if we have the permission of the source of information to share that information, we will share it with that prosecutorial or judicial authority. And at this point, we have received numerous requests. My commissioners don't want to share numbers, and we've made commitments to the states that have requested information that we would not share names, but we say numerous requests from several different member states and that are exercising either their national jurisdiction or acting on the basis of universal jurisdiction. And in most of the cases, we've been able to share a great volume of data. In most cases, because of the wishes of the people we've interviewed, of the victims or witnesses, we've had to redact any information that they feel could lead to the identification of themselves or their families. So that's a very laborious, time-consuming process, but for us, it's been heartening that at least in 3 of the cases where we've shared information, there has been a prosecution, and at least so far, all 3 prosecutions have been successful. Now, of course, we take it to heart, this issue that this policy does not lead necessarily to a strategic approach to investigations, because oftentimes, of course, we realize the national jurisdictions are going with who they can get their hands on or who they have at their disposal. But to us, it's quite important that we continue, and we're always trying to find, we try to find ways to share our data wherever we can. Now, I realize that one of the core parts of this discussion was supposed to be about what are the gaps in universal jurisdiction and accountability, and of course there are rather massive gaps. I like to think of it in this way, that Syria is perhaps the example of the most widespread and intensive conflict since the Second World War, with victimization on just a scale that has not been seen for a very long time. And yet, the total number of UN human rights personnel dedicated to that conflict is less than 35. In another, I mean, you mentioned the fact that I worked for years in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, as in Congo or any of the other major conflict zones, you'll have a human rights presence with over 100 personnel, dedicated human rights personnel who are out documenting violations, publicly reporting on it. And of course, you'll have other personnel there that are designed to help judicial officials and to provide assistance to judicial officials to take hopefully action in terms of accountability. So, you know, the Commission is doing what it can with the resources it has at its disposal. Now, what that means is there is a broad range of areas. You know, we document, we compile that information, and we try to prepare it to share hopefully one day with prosecutors to establish a crime base. But of course, what you do with that information afterwards, how a prosecutor takes the crime base and turns that into an indictment, into a case to take before the courts with actionable evidence, that is, of course, a major gap for which we've waited a long time for a referral either to the ICC or to an ad hoc tribunal. But given that's not forthcoming, universal jurisdiction is what we've got. And that's one of the reasons why it's going to be extremely interesting to see the mechanism. I call it the three-eyed mechanism. Because the triple I-M just doesn't sound, it's not catchy, but the mechanism, of course, it's moving forward, and once it is functional, the Commission is prepared, of course, to work with it. We took a great deal of, we were heartened by the terms of reference and the Secretary General's report that was prepared. The fact that this mechanism is designed to collect the evidence from the groups that have been documenting it, and then to work with the Commission of Inquiry to see where there are gaps in that evidence. To then, of course, it's all about consolidation of that evidence, preserving it, and then analyzing it so that they can build cases that will be ready for any jurisdiction that wants to carry it forward. And it's a very novel approach, and it's something that potentially will be an extremely valuable contribution to the overall effort. And that is, of course, a good attempt to address a major gap, to move the issue forward. And what's most important from our standpoint is that all of these different, there's more than enough room for a number of international actors to push accountability forward. And until there is a referral or a consensus in the Security Council, it's going to take a consolidated, coordinated effort. So between national jurisdictions, between using universal jurisdiction in creative ways, and between a mechanism, between the Commission of Inquiry, and hopefully, eventually, a reinforced UN human rights presence working on Syria, I hope we can move forward with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, James, for elaborating more on the Commission, what it is doing, and what would be the next steps necessary for it really to become effective on a different level. Ambassador Rapp, you're these days at the Hague Institute for Global Justice. You came here from the Netherlands. You're a distinguished fellow at that institute, and you were ambassador at large for war crimes in the US State Department's Office for Global Criminal Justice. The reason why I let you speak last, it's not only that you speak as a guest of honor, but I thought that you, as having been part of international tribunals, to prosecute war crimes, for example, for Rwanda, for Sierra Leone, which was mentioned already today. You could give us the perspective of exactly where James just left it. We don't have a court for referral. So what would you make out of the situation? I think looking at the UN, it's unlikely that we will have in the near future a court. So what can we do with these national efforts?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for including me tonight. I'm just thrilled to be here. On the day after the filing of this complaint here in Germany by the survivors of the torture in Assad's prisons, I was in Madrid a month ago with Toby Cadman and others from Guernica 37 and filing the case in Spain that involves also high-level figures, 9 in that case, 6 in some overlap, though the names haven't been disclosed in Spain. But it's thrilling, one, because these are regime crimes. I mean, Lada was talking about the 90% of the crimes having been committed by the regime. And here we are in the sixth year since the uprising. And we remember how it began with children, students demanding democracy, and some of them being arrested and tortured and their bodies returned to their parents, who were told just make more children. And then when parents took to the street, the parents were shot down. And you have a regime whose whole approach has been one that has actually enabled the terrorists. We wouldn't have the ISIS in control of eastern Syria today were it not for what this regime had done to destroy the middle, to destroy the resilience of potential resilience of Syrian society. And to go after it finally here in these European courts, I think is fantastic. It's wonderful. It's something I've been waiting for and pushing for as long as this has been going on. And secondly, the fact that these are high-level individuals. As Bente said, I was involved as a prosecutor in the Rwanda tribunal, prosecuted in cases involving government ministers and generals and others who were the very top, including the prime minister of that country, went to the Sierra Leone court and prosecuted Charles Taylor. He ended up with a 50-year sentence for aiding and abetting the crimes in Sierra Leone, but he's serving that sentence today, 11 counts of crimes against humanity and war crimes. And I believe, as Justice Jackson said in his opening at Nuremberg, that the common sense of mankind requires that the law not stop with petty crimes by little people. It has to reach men who possess themselves of great power and make deliberate and concerted use of that power to set in motion evils which touch every home. And talk about touching every home. 12 million people from Syria have left their homes. And it's not because there's a war, a civil war. I mean, wars are fought in some places against military targets. Here, it's fought against soft targets. It's people are leaving their homes not because it's impossible to live in those places and to be targeted. I've talked to the parents of children who were on the Caesar photos, whose children were delivering goods for the business on the day they were picked up. Why were they picked up? Who knows? Maybe they were born in Daria, and Daria was supposedly, it was for a long time an area the government couldn't take. They got picked up, never heard about them again until they saw their tortured bodies. That's what's happened here. These crimes demand absolutely accountability, and we're finally seeing that. Now, it's not an international court. It's not the special court for Sierra Leone, a hybrid court. To have a hybrid court, you have to have the country itself ask for it and agree to it. Assad's not going to ask for that. Maybe a future transition, there can be something like that. It's not a Security Council created court like the Yugoslavia or Rwanda one. Obviously, we can't get anything through the Security Council against the Syrian regime, even when you've established a mechanism under on the chemical weapons. Who is the old expression, who you're going to believe, us or your lying eyes. I mean, this fantastic work of the Joint Investigative Mechanism on chemical weapons, completely neutral, well documented, completely dismissed by a couple countries that vetoed the resolution. So we're not going to be able to get to an ad hoc tribunal, and by the same token, as we saw in 2014, we're not going to have a referral to the ICC in any time in the foreseeable future. But what can we do? And what is it that we need to make these cases successful and to cause other cases like them to be successful in the courts, frankly, of third countries, but including third countries like Germany, which has opened its arms to a greater extent than any country in the world to Syrian refugees. It's profoundly impacted by the crime that's there, that has every right for its courts to proceed against these cases in this kind of situation. What's needed? One, prosecutor, you need the evidence, and of course. There's massive evidence of crime-based. That's what we saw from the beginning. What am I talking about when I say crime-based? Those are the pictures of the people that have had horrible things done to them. You need the evidence of responsibility. How did it happen? Who did it? How do you put that chain together? We call it linkage. Patrick was talking about it earlier. It's absolutely essential. One of the things that we began to do right in this area is support documentation efforts by Syrian organizations, by NGOs like CIJA, which I'm actually the chair of as a volunteer advisor for them. They've collected 700,000 pages of regime documents, been able to put together cases, have responded last year to 400 requests from 12 law enforcement agencies in terms of subjects that were present in those countries. We've got the Caesar evidence, and I'm so enormously impressed with that evidence. It's better than we had. I would have loved to have had it in Sierra Leone or Rwanda. They would have liked to have had that kind of evidence at Nuremberg. The Nazis didn't put identification on the bodies of the people that they tortured and killed. And Caesar, thankfully, because of the assistance of a particular government, is safe today. I'm in contact with him regularly, hope to see him again in the next few days. He's given a 50-page statement recently to a judicial magistrate that can be used in all of these cases, but it's, as we've heard, it's immensely important evidence. You don't have this kind of thing in other situations where you have individuals that 700 of whom we've been able to identify. We know when they died, where they died, and they died in the institution of the state security services of the Syrian Arab Republic. Without question. This is one of the more solid cases you will ever get when it comes to these detainees. There are others that are responsible for other crimes, which are more challenging, to be frank, and that's why these documentation efforts are so important. This mechanism that everyone has talked about, and it really is an innovative thing, and I really salute the people that pushed it forward. We obviously have a commission of inquiry, the 6,000 interviews, the great work that they've done, including today with the Aleppo report. But what this mechanism will be able to do is turn to them, work out ways to potentially have access to some of those witnesses. They can turn to the sieges and bring in those documentation and vet it and determine whether there's a chain of custody and determine whether there's forgeries, check the metadata on videos. They can deal with the various organizations of survivors, many of whom were represented here. They can deal with the attacks, which we'll always have, saying, oh, this is fake. They can also deal with stuff that is fake, that's disinformation, that's thrown into the stream. And then they can work with national authorities and really put cases together that will be meaningful and be useful in those states. But that's the second issue. It's courts that have jurisdiction under their law. Where are they? How do they exercise it? What are the sort of policy questions that arise here? And this is frankly a very challenging area, because I think many people know that universal jurisdiction has political downsides to it. We've seen efforts to change the law in Belgium and in Spain in the past, and opposition to countries getting involved in cases where they really don't have a vital interest. And I'd certainly say that in the case of Syria, almost every country in Europe has a vital interest. So this is different. In Germany, for instance, the law does allow for a case without the perpetrator here, and without the crime here, and without the direct victim as a citizen of this country, the so-called passive personality jurisdiction. It can be done here, but it's a decision by the federal prosecutor that has to determine that a number of factors have been met. And one of them, of course, is the presence of witnesses in the country. And having talked, I don't want to quote them out of context, they can speak for themselves, but in context with the German prosecutors, I think they're welcoming the case here, because it's victims coming forth with evidence, breaking down some of the, and I have so much understand it, because I've been dealing with this, trying to connect people from the beginning, situations where I actually had a citizen of another country who was tortured in the Caesar video, and I gave the name to law enforcement, they contacted the family. Family decided they didn't want to cooperate, et cetera. But you've got these sort of tensions, the hostilities that have been created, and frankly, so many Syrians having almost given up hope in this area. So to have this group come forth to the prosecutor's office with this case, so well-founded, and working together, I think really does offer a tremendous opportunity. So a case like that in this country is really, it's not a case that's automatic, in the sense that if they've got a case under the law, under German law, you generally have to pursue that. In a universal jurisdiction case, there's some discretion. And I think that it can be met in this situation. There are other countries that still do have universal jurisdiction, Sweden and Norway in particular. Sweden has done a number of cases, but generally at the lower level, and so far only on the opposition side. But I'm hopeful that they'll begin to use what is actually a new law that doesn't actually go back to the beginning of the Syrian conflict, but there are plenty of crimes since their law passed. The Spanish situation is an interesting one. Spain did change its law under pressure, and that law now does not allow jurisdiction in a number of situations unless there's a Spanish victim. In certain cases, it actually requires the perpetrator to be present. But in the case of what, under Spanish law and precedent, is classified as state-sponsored terrorism, it's possible to proceed if you have someone in Spain that has suffered from terrorism abroad who is the citizen at the time that the crime occurred. That's the basis upon which the sister of one of the Caesar victims petitioned for this case to go forward. And so, and why is it state-sponsored terrorism? Does that strike people as the wrong charge? Quite to the contrary. In cases that have arisen in Latin America, it's very much like that. It's a state that decides that it wants to intimidate its own citizens, discourage them, and indeed the whole way in which this regime and its DNA tortures people and lets some of them out, to be frank, or disappears others, is actually a way in which they terrorize the population into not exercising their rights, their human rights, and finally just submitting to these outrages. And so under the law, this is a case that can be pursued. This does offer this whole other area of the so-called passive personality jurisdiction, which isn't quite universal. This is almost every state allows its courts to prosecute when one of its citizens is killed abroad. I mean, if you were vacationing in Tunisia and you were kidnapped or killed, and that one of those terrorists turned up in your country, you can expect your country probably to prosecute that terrorist because you're a citizen and they're protecting you. But, or they may work it out with the Tunisians, but they will find a way to make sure that there's justice in that case. So that does give you a basis. I know, as our good friend Anwar said, this is always a question of sort of finding somebody that's not a Syrian, and we prefer not to do that. On the other hand, I mean, a lot of these people were Syrians and then became a citizen of another country, and they feel, as I know Amal does in Madrid. I mean, as she said, this brother was the best of the 11 of them, and visited her there, and she visited him in the 20 years that she's been in Spain, and feels just the enormous pain of this crime. And indeed, in these crimes of forced disappearance, it's the family that suffers. I mean, hard to imagine anyone suffering more than you did and others did in these prisons. But when you don't know what's happened, for the victim in the prison, it's a very specific thing. For the family, it's a horror every day. and maybe it never ends. And so they're very much victims too. So this does give us, I think, an avenue into court, and we've got to use those kinds of avenues. Finally, I should note that European prosecutors, of course, what they really want are the bad guys that are in country. And I was involved back in 2004 with the establishment of the European Genocide Network, which includes 28 European Union states plus 4 observers, very active observers, Norway, Switzerland, the US, and Canada. Meets twice a year, has a budget of 80,000 euros only. It's part of Eurojust, and it's a great organization, brings people together. They do share information at their meetings. But they haven't, it hasn't been given a high enough priority, frankly, by the European Union and by Eurojust. One of the positive things that's happening is that Europol is actually gaining jurisdiction over atrocity crimes on May 1st. So the European Police Agency, which headquarters in The Hague, 26 countries are in it, will now coordinate between states in sharing information. And of course, the cases, most of the time people want is if they find somebody there who's lied on their immigration or asylum forms and they've got some information on them, and it's a relatively simple case, those cases get made. I think what's really essential here, and what I hope this mechanism can do, is to at least take that game up several notches. I mean, there are countries, I mean, to be frank, having dealt with the siege evidence, we think there are, even on the regime side, there are scores of major perpetrators in Europe. I know some very high-level ones. Trying to get them prosecuted where they are is not so easy because prosecutors prefer the simpler case of the guy on the video than one where they have to show the whole state structure and bring in a lot of witnesses and take a lot of travel. But if they have this mechanism to work with them, if they can work with the survivors' organizations, if they can work with the jurisdiction next door that's got a witness that can help them, then those cases can be made, and each country can be going after the biggest fish that they have within their jurisdiction. And when in my home country, before I went to the UN, I was a federal prosecutor, and we worked with state prosecutors, sometimes across state lines and with others, and we'd say, you prosecute that guy, and we'll prosecute this one, and we'll testify, we'll provide you with testimony, et cetera. We'll get an insider that will help you in your cases. This is the kind of coordinated approach that's necessary. It's not as good as having a court, an international court, with a prosecutor that can decide these are the biggest fish, and we've got a mandatory Chapter 7 power to get every country in the world to cooperate. Not that they necessarily will, but we don't have that yet. But we can begin to do this, and I think the activism of the victims and survivors, the work of lawyers and organizations like the ECC, HR here, and others is just fantastic. And putting that all together with the kind of evidence that it's been possible to marshal, and with this mechanism, I think we can begin to turn the corner and show that these crimes in Syria will not be committed with impunity. I mean, it is, that's the hardest aspect of this is to, I mean, as someone that spent and I do the Syria work on a volunteer basis, and I've told people I will do it till the day I die, because everything that we've tried to do since Nuremberg, to hold powerful people who commit atrocities to account in order to protect civilians in war zones, is being torn to shreds by what's happening in Syria. I mean, it was Lata who quoted Martin Luther King, and there's lots of good quotes from Martin Luther King, but injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Well, if you can bomb hospitals, if you can torture children, if you can do these kinds of things and get away with it, imagine the conflicts of the coming decades that may not always be in Syria or in a distant land. We are all in danger in this world, and we really need to do everything we can to reinforce the law, but do it, for heaven's sakes, for the benefit of these 12 million, certainly people that have suffered, but the hundreds of thousands who've died, and those that have been driven from their homes because of these crimes. And so tonight, I think, is a celebration, even as we mourn the sixth, all those that have died during the 6 years since this uprising began. It really indicates that we can turn the corner and begin to have justice. And so it's great to be here with everybody. So let's get it done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, this is such a dark point, the reversal of all the achievements in international law, but I really think that this is exactly what we are facing. I would therefore we have very little time left, unfortunately, so if all of you could just take 2 minutes for your final statements, and maybe have this as a thought. And also, I would like to ask all of you, to what extent do you think that the Western focus on terrorism, like Islamist terrorism, as the major threat has made us blind for any other threat that might come to our society, and maybe especially this threat of giving up on our own values?
Thank you very much. شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you very much. Before answering these questions, since we have always been talking about justice here now, I think that justice is a duty that we also thank a group of friends that we've always been talking about Anwar Mazen, but I know there's a big group of friends, of lawyers who have undertaken great efforts, and they deserve all due respect, and some for the reason of their own safety and security. We cannot mention their names. A number of organizations, NGOs in Syria who have contributed a great deal, even on a psychological level, on the level of cooperation. We've all really cooperated on making this claim and this legal action a success for the lawyers community and for the Syrian people itself. So thank you very much to all of those, even if their names are not mentioned. Many of them are present with us here now, and many others are not. So thank you very much to those. One additional point that I missed out on so far. I told you before that the refugees are not going to be back if there's no justice and if there's no accountability. But I forgot to tell you, but I wanted to leave it to the end, that the millions which are still present in Syria, if there's no accountability and justice, they will turn into refugees. They will become refugees. I can guarantee this. The focus on ISIS and the Nusra Front, I think we are one of the peoples who have most suffered from ISIS, Nusra Front, and terrorist organizations. Of course, there's no difference between human beings. Whoever is the victim, we stand beside them. And we are against the terrorists regardless of any other classification. But one of the peoples who have most suffered from the terrorism of ISIS and the Nusra Front are the Syrians and the Iraqis. We have a real interest here to end terrorism and extremism. For each and every non-Syrian victim, these terrorist organizations kill maybe thousands of Syrians. We are always happy, and honestly, I can tell you that when we hear about one of these perpetrators being punished and prosecuted. And we know that our families and relatives will feel safer, but that the principle of justice turns simply and only and exclusively into a security concern for the protection of European societies, we feel that this is unjust. That the principle and the understanding of justice becomes exclusively a political card to utilize and to be instrumentalized within a game of interests at the negotiation table. We feel, in that case, that this is not justice. Justice is one of the most important reasons and the most important instruments to fight terrorism, of which we are the biggest victim. Thank you very much.
I guess I would just have two short reflections on the question of, has there been too much of a focus on terrorism and on radical Islamic terrorism and or violent extremism, depending on which side of the political lexicon you're on. But I mean, I guess I am always suspicious of attempts by law enforcement to address what's in a person's mind and heart. I guess I always come back to two things. One which was something that was told to me by a Bosnian many years ago, who told me that atrocity with impunity is the poison potion that creates terror and a terrorist. And then the other thing that I always come back to as well is the quote of those who are willing to sacrifice rights to achieve security deserve neither. In the end, I mean, the best approach to addressing terror and radicalization is the observance and respect for rights. And if you're trying to de-radicalize or to de-intensify a conflict, it seems the first place to start is the protection of civilians, the very basic protections that even if they aren't in place, they are a point of discussion. Even with the Taliban, they're a point of discussion. And yet in Syria, no one even talks about it. And I find that stunning. I find it inexplicable. I guess the last point I would just like to raise on this whole issue of how one moves forward on these efforts to prosecute, it is just how essential it is for any of you involved in documentation or any of you who have been victimized. If it's possible, save everything. Save your photos, save any documents you have, any medical records you have, save it, because it will be useful one day. And I'll say this just from the point of the commission, from the standpoint of the commission and our efforts to document, we come back again and again. How many times the individuals have told us, if only we had saved our photos, we would give them to you. And I can't tell you how many times if we'd had those photos, we could have made a finding or a stronger finding. And of course, that's then a body of evidence that can be passed on. And I think especially as access to Syria becomes more difficult, as it becomes more and more difficult for Syrians to get out of the country, particularly in situations of sieges and so forth, that extra element of gathering as much physical evidence where metadata or other means of corroboration can be used is absolutely critical. So I would just urge all of you to keep that in mind whenever you're documenting, because I think it's going to be the major challenge for the next phase of this conflict. So.
Yeah, really quickly, I think for obvious reasons it's very dangerous to go down the terrorism paradigm with as many human rights violations that are committed in the so-called fight against terrorism. And I hold it with James. We need to hold the people to account by their actual acts, and that's what we're trying to do. And they do constitute the gravest crimes that the law knows. And Yasmina is sending her consent. And for us, like I said, this really showed us where to continue, basically starting from tomorrow. And Stephen gave sort of an overview over the landscape of possibilities. That's of course very encouraging. And again, this is maybe the case if universal jurisdiction doesn't work in these kind of cases, then where can it work? Where we have all these atrocities, where we have them documented, we have people who come forward to demand justice. And we have all the possibilities to do so, and it will demand, because of the restrictive laws that have been passed in some countries like Spain and Belgium, where sort of the possibility was reduced, as you mentioned. We will need all these great efforts that have been mentioned. Like the case that was brought forward in Spain, like the work of CIJA that has been done in order to work collaboratively and creatively also to use this kind of laws to really do this step by step. And that's also what I told the people who came to testify for this case. I said nobody will go to prison in 2 weeks. We do our best to start this work, and we're trying to put a little piece of the puzzle somewhere. And in the end, it will be a big picture, hopefully. But we're starting with one puzzle, and that's not. I cannot promise you more than that. We're trying to put this piece of the puzzle in there. It will be one, but we're really doing our best to continue adding other ones. And yeah, for me this evening was an encouragement to continue that. Thank you.
And trying to be quick, just one thing in regard to that. I mean, there is an EU arrest warrant mechanism which allows for relatively simple extradition between countries within the EU. I mean, if one country has your case, for instance, is against 6 persons and persons unknown. You know, there can be individuals that are involved in these 3 detention facilities, 215, 235, 227 that you mentioned, who may turn up in some other country, who might be in Bulgaria or might be in Greece or someplace else. You can potentially get an EU arrest warrant to bring them in and try them here if that country doesn't yet have the means to do it. So I do think there's opportunities to coordinate, and I know as a former prosecutor and as an international prosecutor, I mean, it is fun to charge people you don't have in court and keep trying to get them arrested. But most prosecutors would like to have somebody to try. And so I do think it's important that as we build these even universal jurisdiction cases, that we look at places where we may be able to make an arrest of an accomplice and bring them to court and begin the actual work of trying people for these crimes and showing the others that against whom arrest warrants are out, that they face those kind of consequences as well, and people who might do the same kind of conduct, that they would face those consequences. Finally, on your question, I do think it's really important as we look at the crimes of Daesh that, and the situation is frankly a little different than we have in Syria. I mean, we've got the potential in Iraq and in the Kurdish region and other places to really begin to have judicial processes. And we've got people that are coming, hundreds of people that have been arrested as prisoners of war. The organization CIJA, which has dealt with the Iraqi side, we have a brief on the sexual violence and on the killings in Kojo that name hundreds of individual suspects. And it's important, I think, to begin the process of trying people, not for the easy case. I mean, I guess as a prosecutor, I shouldn't be against easy cases, but there's the easy case of trying people because they gave material support to a designated terrorist organization. But if you convict somebody of that, they can just say, well, I'm prosecuted on a political basis because I was fighting for the caliphate or whatever. You should be trying them for rape and sexual slavery, for drug dealing, because they're now using Captagon, an amphetamine, as a major profit source, et cetera. They're doing all sorts of things that completely defy their sort of religious, their kind of religious messaging. It's important, I think, to develop that kind of evidence and try people for those cases. Of course, that's not easy. It's witnesses, documentation, but I think it would help, I think, reveal the true nature of this organization and people that are leaders of it, in the same way that we would be revealing that in the kind of cases that I want to see done on the regime side. But there's no excuse not to actually begin working on developing judicial mechanisms in Iraq and Kurdistan that meet human rights standards. And that can begin to try these individuals. The justice is the best solution to all of these problems, and I'm so glad to see so much support for it here in Germany. Thank you.
Ambassador Rapp, Patrick Brooker, James Rodehaver, and Mazen Darwish, you've been an amazing group to sit with here, and I loved how you shared your insights. I think you all profited a lot, and I see that you all stayed out here. If now you decide to leave, please leave your headphones down there. I have been really asked to say this.